in the 30s in 2008, in the 50s in 2009, and then over 100 in 2010. Back down to the 70s in 2011, the 50s in 2012, and lower still this year, although there was one attack reported this morning in Pakistan. Reports of people killed by attack drones in Pakistan in the period 2004 to 2012 ranged from a low of around 1,600 to a high of twice that. There's controversy over how many of those people killed were civilians. Again, the range is broad. In June 2011, John Brennan, at the time President Obama's chief counterterrorism advisor, announced that, quote, there haven't been a single collateral death, that's death of a civilian, in Pakistan in the previous 10 months. So that would be a low estimate. Others counted civilian deaths in the teens during the same period. For the entire period 2004 to 2012, the estimates varied from the hundreds to the thousands. Why such uncertainty in the numbers of attacks and in the numbers of civilian casualties? 2 points bear emphasis here. First, the drone program is secret. Only in the past couple of years has the US government even acknowledged that a program run by the CIA to carry out targeted killings by drone even existed. Second, there is disagreement over who counts as a civilian, or perhaps we should say, who does not count as a civilian. Among the terms we come across in various investigative reports and daily media stories are terrorist, militant, or enemy. These are not legal terms. These are not the terms found in the various treaties governing warfare, such as the Geneva Conventions. What are the relevant legal instruments, and what do they say about who may be targeted by drones? We anticipate that our debaters will disagree on these points. What about the questions of where the strikes take place? How does what one analyst called the legal geography of war affect our judgment about which drone strikes are legal and which illegal? Implicit in our participants' answers to these questions will be some notion of what US drone policy should be. In response to increasing criticism of his administration's policy, President Obama addressed the issue of drone strikes for the first time in detail just last May in a speech to the National Defense University. And he described what he considered the appropriate precautions to prevent unintended civilian harm. We're curious what our debate participants think about the administration's criteria and whether they would be willing to propose something different. In his speech, President Obama acknowledged public concern about civilian casualties and what he called the wide gap between US assessments of such casualties and non-governmental reports. He also acknowledged his own personal regret about civilian deaths, pointing out that, quote, for the families of those civilians, no words or legal construct can justify their loss. Those deaths, he said, will haunt us long as we live, just as we are haunted by the civilian casualties that have occurred throughout conventional fighting in Afghanistan and Iraq. I'd like to take a minute to highlight this last point. We have organized this debate around the legality of targeted killings by drones. But even at the highest estimates, these weapons have killed far fewer civilians than the other military practices that have characterized the wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, and the border areas of Pakistan. Again, the estimates vary, but it is certain that hundreds of thousands of people have died as a consequence of the wars launched in the aftermath of the September 2001 terrorist attacks, with tens of thousands of violent civilian deaths directly attributable to military action. So I just want to acknowledge that even though we might be focusing on seemingly narrow issues of legality of drone strikes, we are doing so in a context of wars that have wrought a tremendous toll on soldiers and civilians alike. that context is part of what drives the interest in debating drones. Finally, it is not likely that our debate will be confined to the narrowest legal issues, certainly not in the discussion period that follows. It is natural to want to bring into our analysis such questions as, is there a tension between legality and the pragmatic goals of undermining terrorist plots? What are the possible counterproductive consequences of drone strikes in unstable areas? Are they indeed serving as recruiting tools for terrorism, as some have argued? Or are they destroying terrorist networks, as others have maintained? Is there something morally objectionable about killing at such a distance that only the targeted suspect, not the drone operator, faces risk of death? Now that President Obama has finally acknowledged the existence of a program of targeted killing by drones, what is the appropriate role of public opinion at home and abroad, and of public debate of the kind that we're having today? To help us address some of these questions, we have the privilege of hearing three of the foremost legal authorities on the subject of targeted killing by drones, two visitors and one member of our own law faculty. Let me introduce them to you now. Marion O'Connell is the Robert and Marion Short Professor of Law and is Research Professor of International Dispute Resolution at the Kroc Institute at the University of Notre Dame. Her research is in the areas of general international law on the use of force, and international legal theory. She's the author or editor of numerous books and articles on these subjects. I hope you'll forgive me if I only mention one of them, and also for the choice of which one. It's a chapter called Banning Autonomous Killing in a book published by Cornell University Press, forthcoming, called The American Way of Bombing, edited by Henry Shue and me. And our editors in the audience, so I promised him I would make that plug. Professor O'Connor earned her A.B. in History at Northwestern with highest honors. She won a Marshall Scholarship for graduate study in the UK, where she earned a Master's in International Relations at the London School of Economics, an LLB at Cambridge University. She holds a JD from Columbia Law School, where she won the Berger Prize for International Law, and a PhD from Cambridge University. She was Vice President of the American Society of International Law. She chaired the Use of Force Committee of the International Law Association and is a member of the German Society for International Law and the International Institute of Humanitarian Law in San Remo. She's also been a faculty member at The Ohio State University, the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, Bologna Center, and Indiana University. In the late 1990s, she was a professional military educator for the U.S. Department of Defense in Garmisch-Partenkirchen, Germany. And prior to joining the academy, she practiced law with the Washington, D.C.-based international firm Covington and Burling. Michael W. Lewis is a professor of law at Ohio Northern University School of Law. He has written extensively on various aspects of the laws of war and the conflict between the U.S. and Al-Qaeda, and has been cited by the 9th, 7th, and 11th Circuit Courts of Appeals. He's testified before Congress on the legality of drone strikes in Pakistan and Yemen, and on the civil liberties trade-offs associated with trying some Al-Qaeda members or terrorist suspects before military commissions. He earned his JD from Harvard Law School cum laude in 1998. Prior to entering law school, he served in the U.S. Navy from 1987 to 1995, where he flew F-14s from the aircraft carrier USS Independence. He participated in Operation Desert Shield and Operation Desert Storm. He graduated from the Navy's Topgun fighter weapons school in 1992. I promised him I would also plug his book, Laws of War and the War on Terror, coming out in the 2nd edition soon. Against David Ohlin is professor of law here at Cornell. He specializes in international law and all aspects of criminal law. His latest work concentrates on the topic of our debate, legal implications of remotely piloted drone attacks. And he is co-editor of a collected volume entitled Targeted Killings, Law and Morality in an Asymmetric World, out from Oxford University Press. Professor Ohlin's current research also focuses on the normative application of criminal law concepts in international criminal law, especially in regard to genocide, torture, joint criminal enterprise, and co-perpetration, as well as the philosophical foundations of collective criminal action. His work has been cited by judges and litigants at several international tribunals, including the International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia and the International Criminal Court, and blogs. www.libercode.org. I'm delighted to have all three participants here in our debate. The format for the debate is as follows. By mutual agreement, Professor O'Connell will make the first remarks, and Professor Lewis will respond. Then Professor Ohlin will pose questions of clarification to which the debaters will make brief responses. The main goal being to identify key elements of disagreements. After Professor Ohlin summarizes the state of the debate, we'll open up for questions and comments from the floor directed to all three panelists, and then we'll offer the debaters an opportunity for brief concluding remarks. Thank you. Okay.
We decided we'll stay here because of the long walk over to we'll save our energy for the discussion. Let me start with some more about that very first U.S. targeted killing by drone in Yemen. It occurred on November 4th, 2002. The CIA carried out a missile attack that ended up killing, as Matt said, 6 people in the impoverished nation of Yemen. The agents responsible were not in Yemen, they were in Djibouti on Africa's east coast. They used a remotely piloted Predator drone to launch 2 Hellfire missiles at a passenger vehicle traveling on a rural road. The 6 passengers were killed. The 23-year-old American's name was Kamal Derwish. He was from near Buffalo, New York. After the attack, the CIA was able to send a helicopter to the scene, where agents went to the ground, collected DNA samples from the bodies of the victims, and flew away. It was the CIA carrying out that attack and not the U.S. Air Force, which at that time generally had control of the drone fleet. Because the U.S. Air Force, according to the Los Angeles Times, had legal concerns with carrying out such an attack. Apparently, the CIA had no such concerns, but they should have. The Air Force was right. In January 2003, the UN Special Rapporteur for Extrajudicial Killing, Asma Jahangir, a Pakistani human rights lawyer who has won awards for her work, issued her legal assessment of those killings in Yemen. They constituted unlawful executions. I concluded the same in a book chapter published 1 year later. That chapter was edited by 3 of Germany's leading international law specialists on resort to armed force. None of us had any doubt. Using military force outside of an armed conflict zone or a battle zone is unlawful under international law unless there is a right to attack with military force under one of 3 narrow exceptions under international law. None of those exceptions applied in Yemen in November 2002, nor have those exceptions generally applied to the vast majority of U.S. drone strikes in Yemen, Pakistan, and Somalia since 2002 and continuing, as Matt said, until this morning. In 11 years, in 3 countries, drone strikes have claimed the lives of no fewer than 2,500 people, but probably much closer to the high estimate of over 4,000. And among those persons killed, as many as 205 have been children. Any discussion of the use of military force, which clearly includes the Hellfire missile fired from Predator and Reaper drones, must start with the core principle of our world post-World War II. And that's Article 2.4 of the United Nations Charter. The Charter is a multilateral treaty principally drafted by the United States and binding on the United States. Indeed, the United States argued before the International Court of Justice in 1984, and that was during the Reagan administration, that Article 2.4, this general prohibition on resort to military force, is no mere treaty rule, but is a peremptory or jus cogens norm of international law, a higher norm that may not be changed through adopting a new treaty rule or through contrary state practice. And this is because of its essential, fundamental, moral character. The International Court of Justice has emphasized in a number of cases that Article 2.4 is indeed a general prohibition on resort to force, and further, that any lawful resort to force must be within one of the exceptions to Article 2.4. There are only 2 exceptions in the Charter. Under Article 51 of the Charter, a state that is a victim of an armed attack that has already occurred or is occurring may respond in individual or collective self-defense until the Security Council acts. The International Court of Justice has further clarified that the armed attack that triggers this right of self-defense in Article 51 must be a significant armed attack. And any military force undertaken by the defending state may only be used against a state and on its territory that is itself responsible for that initial armed attack. Before a defending state releases its force in self-defense, its counterattack, it must make an assessment that a use of military force against another state is necessary to accomplish the purpose of defense, is a last resort, and will succeed in accomplishing that defense. The state must also make an assessment that its use of force, even if necessary, will not cause disproportionate harm to the defense that it seeks. Disproportionate harm in terms of the lives lost, the lives injured, the property damaged, and the human environment or the natural environment destroyed. If a state wants to resort to military force in situations where there is no armed attack, or where the use of force will not accomplish the defensive purpose, or not accomplish it disproportionately. In other words, if it wants to use military force outside the rules of self-defense, the UN Charter provides for that state to go to the Security Council and to get authorization, as the United States did in 2011 when we wanted to use military force in Libya. There is one more narrow exception to the general ban on resort to military force. States seem to accept that if a government in control of a state is facing an armed rebellion, a civil war on its territory, that government may invite assistance onto the territory to suppress that civil war. Today, the United States' use of force in Afghanistan is justified on this basis, on the fact that there's a civil war in Afghanistan. The United States and other countries are fighting to keep Hamid Karzai as the government of Afghanistan. Today, the Loya Jirga in Afghanistan is debating about whether, on what basis, the U.S. future presence will go forward, but it will not be, the United States has made clear, as a combat party. The new draft Status of Forces Agreement also says that the U.S. will not attack other countries from Afghanistan's territory. So, but before that, from mid-2002 until today, any assistance and fighting in Afghanistan has been in a civil war. These 3 legal justifications are the only lawful basis for resort to military force under international law, and there is virtually no evidence that any of them apply to the waves of drone attacks in Yemen that began in 2002, in Pakistan that began in 2004, or in Somalia that began in 2006. The Bush administration, which initiated these attacks, has refused to discuss them and certainly did not tell us what the legal basis were that they asserted for the defense. By contrast, the Obama administration has made numerous speeches, and we've seen leaked documents about their legal argument. In none of these